The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta. Major Aaliyah Brooks, dressed casually in jeans and a gray hoodie, was heading home after visiting her sister. Her military ID rested in the side pocket of her handbag, as it always did. As she turned onto a quieter street, blue and red lights suddenly flared in her rearview mirror. Sighing, Aaliyah pulled over calmly to the side of the road. A tall officer, stern and rigid, stepped out of the squad car. Without much pause, he approached her window. "License and registration," he said sharply. Aaliyah complied immediately, offering both documents with a respectful tone. "Sure, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in, eyes scanning her face and then darting around the car. "Where are you headed?" "Home," she replied simply. "I just left my sister's place." "You from around here?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "I live 10 minutes from here," she said. "What's this about?" Instead of answering, the officer walked to the back of her vehicle, inspecting her tags. Aaliyah watched in the mirror, feeling the tension in her chest tighten. She had done nothing wrong. No speed. No signal missed. Nothing. When the officer returned, his tone hadn't softened. "Step out of the vehicle." Aaliyah paused. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle." Without protest, she complied. She had learned a long time ago to remain calm, no matter how questionable the situation. But something about this stop felt unnecessary, invasive. As she stood on the side of the road, she reached for her ID wallet. That's when everything changed. The officer watched closely as Aaliyah reached into her handbag. His posture tensed, his hand drifting near his holster. "I'm just grabbing my identification," she said calmly, sensing his unease. She pulled out a slim, black leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing her U.S. Army ID. Her name and photo were neatly positioned beside the unmistakable golden eagle insignia of a field-grade officer. "Major Aaliyah Brooks, United States Army," it read. The officer's face froze. For a second, the air between them thickened with silence. He blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "You're military?" he asked, his voice suddenly unsure. "Yes," she replied coolly. 17 years active duty. Just returned from a training rotation." The shift in his demeanor was almost instant. He took a half step back, cleared his throat, and looked down at the ID again as if needing a second confirmation. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he mumbled. "Because you didn't ask," she replied. Her tone was respectful, but firm. He stood there, grasping for a response, the earlier authority in his voice now noticeably absent. "You weren't speeding," he muttered. "I thought maybe, your plate looked like it wasn't from around here." "My tags are Georgia," she pointed out. "Just like my license. Just like my residence." There was no anger in her voice, only the controlled poise of someone who had been through worse and risen above it. The officer fumbled with his words, his previous confidence crumbling. "Look, I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered. "You understand, sometimes we have to be cautious." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "Cautious? Or presumptive?" He opened his mouth to respond but quickly shut it. The awkward silence that followed was louder than any excuse he could have offered. She continued, her voice measured but impactful. "You made assumptions based on how I looked, not what I did. You didn't approach me with curiosity. You approached me with suspicion." The officer lowered his gaze. "I've led troops overseas. I've trained soldiers under live fire. And I've done it all while carrying the same ID you just questioned." He looked up again, something shifting behind his eyes, shame, maybe. Or realization. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "That's the problem," Aaliyah replied. You didn't care to know until you saw a title. Another pause. The officer glanced at the ground, then slowly extended her license and registration back to her with both hands, far more respectful than when he had first demanded them. I apologize, he muttered. Aaliyah took her documents, nodded, and gave a firm but civil response, be better. For everyone you stop after this. She didn't wait for his reply. With quiet dignity, she got back in her car and pulled away, leaving the officer standing there under the fading sun, still processing the moment that Aaliyah drove off. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, but her mind was anything but quiet. She wasn't angry. She was used to moments like that. But tonight, something about it struck deeper. Not because she needed validation. Not because she needed an apology. But because, once again, her rank had earned her respect that should have been given from the start, to any person, in any situation. Back at the station, the officer sat in his patrol car for a long time before turning the key. He replayed the encounter over and over, realizing just how quickly he'd made judgments. Not based on behavior. Not based on any threat. Just assumptions. He knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about how he showed up in the world, how his badge didn't excuse bias or shortcuts in human decency. The next day, Aaliyah reported the incident, not to get anyone in trouble, but to make sure it didn't happen to someone else who didn't carry a military ID to prove they were worth listening to. Her story quietly made its way through the department. A reminder to many, especially one shaken officer, that authority doesn't come from a badge or a rank. It comes from how you treat people when you think no one's watching. Weeks later, Aaliyah received a letter. It was on official department stationery, signed by the precinct captain. Major Brooks, I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated during the traffic stop. We've initiated additional training focused on professional conduct and implicit bias, not because of public pressure, but because your calm, dignified response revealed something we needed to address. Thank you for your service, both in uniform and in the way you handled that moment. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not because it erased what happened, but because it meant her voice had made an impact. Quiet change was still change. Back at the precinct, the officer who had stopped her had started attending every optional training session, sitting in the front, asking questions, listening more than talking. His fellow officers noticed, not because he made a show of it, but because something in him had genuinely shifted. And somewhere across town, Aaliyah laced up her boots for another day of service. Not just to the military, but to something greater, a world where respect didn't have to be earned through credentials, but offered freely through humanity. The real strength that night wasn't shown through rank. It was shown through restraint, grace, and the quiet power of being unshakably composed when it mattered most. The true lesson had landed, and it kept echoing. Months later, Aaliyah was invited to speak at a local leadership forum, not as a military officer, but as a community role model. The topic, composure under pressure and the power of presence. She shared the story, not to shame the officer, but to illuminate the broader issue of how assumptions, unchecked, can erode trust. Her audience, a mix of civic leaders, educators, cadets, and police trainees, sat in rapt silence as she described the night she was pulled over. She never raised her voice. She didn't dramatize the details. Her power came through calm conviction. What stopped that night from escalating wasn't just my ID, she said. It was the fact that I refused to match panic with panic. I stood in who I was, not in title, but in character. That is strength. That is leadership. Afterward, several young cadets approached her, saying they'd never forget that story. One of them, nervously holding a notepad, asked if she had advice for someone just entering the field. Aaliyah smiled. Yes. See the person first, not the profile. And never forget, one moment of judgment can last a lifetime for the other person. What began as a tense roadside encounter had grown into something much larger, a spark that lit conversations, changed habits, and reminded everyone watching that real authority starts with how you treat others, especially when you think you don't have to. And that's the legacy Aaliyah left, not just in uniform, but in how she carried herself when no one expected her to carry anything at all. Several months after the forum, the officer who had stopped Aaliyah sat alone in the precinct break room, watching her keynote replayed on the department's internal training feed. He had watched it before. More than once. But this time, he wasn't watching it out of guilt. He was watching it out of admiration. What struck him wasn't just her message, it was how she never once mentioned his name, never tried to destroy his career or publicly shame him. She could have. But she didn't. She chose grace. And that grace had changed him more than punishment ever could. He began volunteering at community youth events, especially with young cadets who were training for law enforcement careers. When asked why he was so invested now, he always gave the same answer, because I got a wake-up call, and I was lucky enough to receive it from someone who didn't turn her back on us. She led without raising her voice. Aaliyah never asked for credit. She never needed the spotlight. But unknowingly, she had become a silent mentor to someone who had once seen her only through a narrow lens. That night on the roadside no longer lived as a stain, it became a turning point. A mark of growth, humility, and the kind of leadership that can't be taught in textbooks. Sometimes, the most powerful ranks aren't stitched onto a uniform, they're earned in how you make others better just by refusing to stoop to the level they expect. And that's exactly what Major Aaliyah Brooks had done. Now, even those who once underestimated her, quietly carried her example forward. A year later, Aaliyah received a phone call from the local police academy. The training director had seen her forum speech and wanted to invite her as a guest speaker for their new recruit orientation. She almost declined, her schedule was packed, and she wasn't sure if her story would still resonate. But something told her to say yes. When she arrived at the academy, she was greeted with quiet respect, no fanfare, just genuine gratitude. Among the rows of fresh-faced recruits, she recognized someone in the back of the room, the same officer from the roadside stop. Now wearing a different uniform, that of an instructor. He gave her a small nod. She returned it, saying nothing, but understanding everything. During her talk, Aaliyah didn't dwell on rank, race, or resentment. Instead, she focused on choices. Every person you stop, every person you question, they'll remember how you made them feel far longer than they'll remember what you said. That moment may last 2 minutes for you, but it could echo for years in their life. Afterward, the officer approached her, now with a steady humility. "I never got the chance to really thank you," he said. Aaliyah offered a warm, sincere handshake. "You just did, by being here. And by helping shape the next generation to do better." They parted ways without ceremony, no cameras, no applause. But something meaningful had been planted. Aaliyah's quiet act of strength had sparked change not only in one man, but in an entire institution. Her legacy wasn't a plaque or a headline. It was living proof that when grace meets pressure, it can bend even the most rigid systems toward justice. 2 years later, Aaliyah received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address, just a folded piece of stationery with careful penmanship, "Dear Major Brooks, I'm graduating the academy next week. I wanted you to know that your story is the reason I joined, not to enforce, but to protect. You probably don't remember me, but I was a teenager at that community event years ago, when you told us to see the person first. That stuck with me. I hope one day to carry my badge the way you carry your name, with honor, discipline, and quiet power. Thank you for changing the way I see people, and myself." Aaliyah smiled, folded the letter carefully, and placed it next to her military commendations, not above them, not below them, but beside them. Because to her, true impact wasn't about medals or stripes. It was about the ripple effect. A single moment. A single response. A single decision to stay composed. That choice had inspired reform, reshaped an officer, guided a recruit, and awakened a department. And in quiet moments, when she thought no one was watching, she had changed far more than she ever expected. She didn't just carry rank. She carried responsibility. And that made all the difference. Now her story lived on, not in headlines, but in hearts. One quiet morning at Fort Benning, Major Aaliyah Brooks stood beside a group of young soldiers during their final leadership seminar. The topic was resilience, something she had plenty of experience with. As she began speaking, one of the new instructors introduced her with a story. It was the officer. Now retired from patrol duty, he had joined the Army's civilian training outreach. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to share how this woman changed my life, not with a speech, not with anger, but with how she treated me when I least deserved grace." A few recruits raised eyebrows. He nodded toward Aaliyah. "She didn't just check me that day, she awakened me." Aaliyah stood, steady as always, but this time, visibly moved. As she delivered her talk, she realized her journey had rippled outward in ways she'd never imagined, into law enforcement, military training, and young minds still forming their view of authority and service. "You don't need to shout to be heard," she told them. "You don't need to punish to make someone change. You just need to hold your ground with honor. And let the truth do the rest." The room erupted in applause. Not because of a viral moment or a dramatic takedown, but because the quiet strength she carried that night had turned into a legacy of leadership. One that reminded everyone in the room, respect isn't given because of rank or power, it's earned through how you treat others when no one's watching. Aaliyah never set out to change the world. She just refused to let it change her. And that made all the difference. A few months later, Aaliyah received an invitation, not from the military, not from the city, but from a graduating class of new police cadets. They had voted unanimously to honor her with a small plaque during their ceremony. It read, "To Major Aaliyah Brooks, for showing us that strength isn't in force, but in restraint. You didn't raise your voice. You raised our standards." She stood on the stage, holding the plaque, looking out at dozens of new officers who had been taught, from day one, about the traffic stop that changed everything. Not because it made headlines, but because it planted roots. And Aaliyah realized something simple yet profound: you don't have to be loud to lead. You don't have to fight to win. And sometimes, the most unforgettable lessons come from a single, silent choice to rise above. She never planned to become a symbol. She just refused to shrink. Now, her name didn't echo in the halls out of fear, it echoed because it reminded others who they should strive to be. A leader. A protector. A standard. Years later, Aaliyah Brooks retired from active duty with full honors. But her story didn't end with medals or salutes. Instead, it lived on in the unseen moments, in the officer who now trains rookies to lead with empathy. In the young woman who joined the military after hearing Aaliyah speak. In the police academy that made her story required reading for all new recruits. She had never sought attention. Never demanded recognition. She simply did what leaders do, she held the line between dignity and reaction, between power and patience. And in doing so, she created change without ever raising her voice. Years from now, no one may remember the badge number of the officer who pulled her over. But they will remember the major who stayed calm, stood firm, and inspired a shift across two uniforms, and far beyond them both. Because Aaliyah Brooks didn't just wear a title.